Forgotten Village, Episode 0. The first curse. There was a village that once existed in the far northern mountains. No official records mention its name. No maps mark its location. But the elders in nearby towns whisper of it, a place the earth itself tried to erase. They call it the Forgotten Village. The last known event linked to this place happened in 1937, when an entire village disappeared overnight. Not a single soul was left. Not a single body was found. Only one thing remained. A journal wrapped in blood-stained silk, its pages still damp as though they were breathing. This is where the story begins. The arrival of the stranger. It started when a stranger arrived at the village gate, cloaked in rain-soaked fabric, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat made of straw. No one saw his face. No one heard his voice. But every dog in the village howled the moment he crossed the boundary stone. The village elder, Old Man Salazar, greeted him reluctantly, feeling a chill seep into his bones. The stranger carried only a wooden box, sealed with black wax, and the scent of damp earth clung to his clothes. When asked where he came from, the stranger raised a single finger to his lips, a gesture so unnerving that Old Man Salazar swore his heart missed a beat. That night, the stranger disappeared into the village's only abandoned house, a crumbling shack at the edge of the forest. The house belonged to a widow who hanged herself decades before. No one had set foot inside since. By dawn, smoke rose from the house's chimney, and by evening the curse had begun. The first death, the first to die, was Catalina, a young girl known for singing lullabies to her baby brother by the village well. She was found at the bottom of the well, her throat torn open as though something had clawed its way inside. But the strangest part was her song. Even after her body was pulled from the water, the villagers could still hear her lullaby echoing from the well every midnight. The elder called for a village meeting, demanding the stranger present himself. But the house stood empty, the black wax seal broken, and the wooden box gone. In its place, scrawled across the walls in mud and blood, was a single word: debt. The curse revealed the village healer, an old woman named Isabel, confessed that the land beneath the village was never meant to be settled. Long before the village was built, this land was a burial ground for cursed souls, outcasts, witches, traitors, and those who died screaming without a proper burial. The village had unknowingly built their homes upon a wound, and now it was opening again. Isabel revealed something even darker. Every generation, a sacrifice was required to keep the curse asleep. The firstborn of the village had to be offered to the earth. But the villagers had broken the pact 70 years ago, choosing instead to bury a false offering, a piglet dressed in the clothes of a child. The curse had not forgotten, and now it had come to collect. The night of no shadows, 3 days after Catalina's death, the village experienced a night unlike any before. No moonlight, no stars, and every flame, from lanterns to hearth fires, refused to burn. The village was swallowed in absolute darkness. People reported seeing figures moving in the dark, shapes that belonged to no living thing. Some saw faces they recognized, the dead returned. Others saw themselves, twisted and broken, as if death was showing them what was coming. By dawn, 5 more villagers were gone, their beds filled with black soil where their bodies should have been. The forbidden ritual desperate, Old Man Salazar unlocked a hidden chest beneath the village shrine. Inside was a scroll handwritten by the village founders. It detailed the forbidden ritual, a last resort to seal the curse away. But performing it came at a cost. One villager must willingly offer their soul and their voice to become the curse keeper. They would live forever bound to the land, unable to speak, unable to die, serving only as the curse's guardian. No one volunteered, until the voice of Catalina sang again from the well. Only this time, she was standing there, her pale hands folded, her eyes missing, her lips still moving in silent song. She was willing. The ritual begins that night. The villagers gathered at the well, forming a circle under the dark sky. Catalina stood in the center, her bare feet sinking into the earth. Isabel drew ancient symbols around her using a mixture of ash, blood, and river clay. The villagers chanted, repeating the old words that had been passed down in secret. Blood remembers, soil binds, voice fades. The ground split open, and from the darkness below, hands reached up, pale, twisted hands belonging to every soul the village had ever owed. Catalina stepped into the earth, her lullaby continuing even as the soil swallowed her. And with her, the curse was sealed for now. The price of silence, the village fell into uneasy silence. The curse was contained, but only by Catalina's eternal suffering. Every generation, the villagers would leave offerings at the well. Toys, clothes, food, as if she were still alive. But one by one they left. Some from guilt, some from fear, and some because they could still hear her voice, no matter how far they ran. By 1937, the village stood almost empty. And then, on the night of the spring equinox, the village vanished completely. No sign of struggle, no sign of life. Only the well remained, with a single doll sitting at its edge, its eyes missing. The blood-stained journal years later, a group of explorers found a single journal near the site where the village once stood. Its pages were soaked in blood and rain, but one entry was still legible. She sings still, even when no one listens. The final page simply said, "Debt paid." The curse awakens now, decades later. Those who venture too close to the lost village say they can still hear a lullaby carried by the wind. And if you find the well, you'll see your own reflection at the bottom, even if you're standing far away. Because the curse remembers you, and one day it will collect again. The Forgotten Village, Episode 1. The village that vanished for 87 years. No one spoke its name. Maps pretended it never existed. Old men refused to tell their grandchildren about it. Even those who remembered seeing its rooftops peeking above the trees forced themselves to forget. But curiosity has a way of waking what should stay buried. It started with a letter, slipped beneath the door of a university anthropology professor. A letter sealed with black wax and signed only with 3 letters. CVW inside was a hand-drawn map, ink faded, edges burnt, and beneath the map, a single line of text written in shaking cursive. She still sings. The expedition Dr. Elias Moran had studied countless lost villages in his career, but none intrigued him like this. No records, no government acknowledgement. Just whispers among old fishermen and faded superstitions carved into church pews. Together with his assistant, Lucia, and 2 graduate students, Ben and Sophia, they followed the map into the mountains. Each step felt like crossing into somewhere they didn't belong. Birds fell silent, insects refused to sing, and even the wind forgot to move. On the 3rd day, they saw it. Hidden in a valley between 2 ridges, swallowed by mist, lay the forgotten village. Its houses leaning like tired bones, roofs half-collapsed, doors swaying on rusted hinges. The air stank of wet earth and something sweeter, the sickly scent of rot masked by wildflowers. The well that watches, the first thing they found was the well. It stood in the village center, wrapped in ivy and thorns. Its stones were slick with moss, but in the morning sun, something glistened beneath the green, fingernail scratches, carved deep into the rock. Ben leaned over the edge to shine his flashlight down. The beam barely touched the bottom, where something white floated just out of focus. A doll? A bone? Or was it a face? He swore it blinked. The houses that breathed, they split into pairs to explore the houses. Each one told a story in silence. Plates still sitting on tables, clothes hung carefully on pegs, dirt paths worn into floors from pacing feet. In one house, Lucia found a pair of shoes, too small for an adult, too elegant for a child, set beside a candle that had burned to a puddle of wax. On the wall above them, someone had carved a message. We should have left her in the earth. The widow's house, they saved the widow's house for last. The house that Catalina's family once lived in. Its door hung wide open, the floorboards sagging beneath decades of damp. In the center of the main room stood a single chair, facing a mirror that had cracked into a spiderweb of glass. Lucia stepped closer and froze. Her reflection wasn't her own. A girl stood there, wearing a white dress stained with mud and blood, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. Her eyes, empty sockets filled with shadow, stared straight ahead. Lucia screamed. The others ran in, but the mirror only showed their own faces, pale, shaken, but normal. Except Ben swore the reflection of the chair was empty. The singing night that night, they camped at the village edge. None of them wanted to sleep inside the houses. The air was too thick, too watchful. Sometime after midnight, Sophia shook Elias awake. "Do you hear that?" It was soft at first, like the wind brushing through leaves, but it grew clearer, higher, until it became a lullaby. A child's voice, singing in a language none of them understood. Lucia recognized the melody. It was the same song her grandmother used to hum when she was a child, the same song she had dreamed about ever since they started this journey. The sound came from the well. The offering drawn like sleepwalkers, they circled the well. The singing stopped the moment they arrived. Sophia held up her phone to record, but the screen flickered, static crawling over the image until it showed something impossible. The four of them standing exactly as they were, but with blood streaming from their mouths and eyes. The phone died, and from the well, the doll floated up, waterlogged, eyes missing, arms folded neatly across its chest. Pinned to its dress was a note. "The earth remembers the dead." The journal inside the widow's house, beneath a loose floorboard, they found the journal, the one left behind after the village vanished. Its pages were damp, ink smudged, but some words burned through the water stains. "We sealed her, but she still sings. Every step we take feeds her. The earth is not soil, it is teeth." On the final page, someone had written in a trembling hand, "If you read this, leave before she learns your name." The forgotten feast, desperate for answers, they returned to the shrine at the village edge. Carved into the wood was a depiction of the forbidden ritual, the one meant to seal the curse. But the carving was incomplete, half erased by deep gouges that looked more like claw marks. Beneath the carving lay a table, and on it, a feast untouched, plates piled high with raw meat crawling with worms. Glasses filled with dark liquid, too thick to be wine, stood ready. It was a table set for four. The reflection room in the shrine's back room stood another mirror, this one unbroken, its surface rippling like water. When they looked into it, they didn't see themselves. They saw the villagers, the ones who vanished, standing behind them, faces blank, mouths sewn shut. And at the center stood Catalina, her hands folded in prayer, but her eyes locked on Lucia. Lucia spoke her name. The mirror shattered. The first loss that night, Sophia vanished from her tent. They found her shoes at the well's edge, filled with black water. On the stone, scratched in the same hand as the old carvings, was a new message. One by one, the hunt panic set in. Ben wanted to leave immediately, but Elias insisted they needed evidence. If they left empty-handed, who would believe them? They needed proof, photos, recordings, anything. But the village didn't want to be remembered. Every photo they took turned to black. Every recording was only the sound of breathing. Every footprint they left in the mud filled with blood. The road that loops the next morning, they tried to leave. They followed the path back the way they came, but after 2 hours they stood back at the village gate. They tried again. Different path, different direction. Back at the village gate. The village had swallowed them whole. The final revelation inside the widow's house, on the wall behind the mirror, they found a final carving, older than the village itself. It showed a girl in white, standing beside a well. Around her stood 4 figures, hands raised in worship. And beneath them all, the earth opened, filled not with bones, but with faces. Faces of those who tried to forget. The village didn't vanish. The village became the curse. And now, so had they. The Forgotten Village, Episode 2. Whispers from the well remembers. That was the first thought running through Lucia's mind as dawn spilled its pale light over the village square. The well stood there, silent but awake, its cracked stones slick with mist and something darker that the morning sun couldn't wash away. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the water was still whispering. It always had. Echoes of the missing with Sophia gone. The air felt heavier. No one said it out loud, but the fear sat thick on their tongues. Elias clutched the journal they found the night before, reading and rereading the final page until his knuckles turned white. One by one, Lucia stood by the well, fingers tracing the scratches along its edge. Marks left by fingernails, not tools. The stone felt strangely warm, like skin stretched too tight over old bones. Each groove told a story of someone who had tried to climb out, but they didn't. The first whisper came just after sunrise, curling out of the well like mist, twisting through the air before settling into words. Broken, incomplete, like a radio barely tuned. Lucia. She staggered back, heart hammering. The voice was familiar. Sophia? No, older, softer, worn down by time and sorrow. It was Catalina. The choice Ben refused to go near the well, pacing like a caged animal while Elias tried to make sense of the journal's fragmented warnings. But Lucia couldn't look away. There was something pulling her, a thread woven through her veins, tugging her toward the dark mouth of the well. "We need answers," she said, voice shaking but resolute. "If Sophia's down there, she's gone," Ben cut in sharply. "We need to leave." But there was no way out. Every path they followed looped back. Every step led to the well. The village wasn't a place anymore. It was a trap. The doll returns as they argued. A soft plop echoed from the well. Lucia stepped closer, peering into the shadowed depths. Floating up from the dark, waterlogged and bloated, was the same doll they found the night before. But this time its mouth was sewn shut with black thread. Lucia reached out, and the doll's eyes snapped open. They were Sophia's eyes. The broken reflection the mirror in the widow's house had cracked further overnight, each fracture splitting into dozens of tiny webs, until the glass was more scar than reflection. But when Lucia passed by, something caught her eye. Her reflection wasn't following her movements. It stood still, eyes locked onto hers, lips moving silently, whispering words Lucia couldn't hear. She stepped closer, heart pounding, breath fogging the glass. Her reflection raised its hand and pressed its palm against the inside of the mirror. A perfect bloody handprint bloomed against the surface. Lucia's hands were clean. The journal speaks. Elias flipped deeper into the journal, past the pages they skimmed the night before. In the right light, invisible ink bled to the surface. Words scrawled in desperate, slanted script. "Do not listen at the well. Her voice is a hook. If you answer, she knows your name." Ben snatched the journal, furious. "We're wasting time on ghost stories. She's dead. This whole village is dead. We need to." The whisper came again, louder this time. Ben. He knew his name now. The silent procession as the sun slid lower. They saw them, shadows gathering at the village edge, standing in the fog just beyond the trees. They stood shoulder to shoulder, unmoving, mouths sewn shut, eyes reflecting the dying light. The villagers, the forgotten, the ones who never left. Each of them carried a doll, stitched from burlap and bone, each doll missing its eyes. And they were all facing the well. The well remembers. Lucia couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the whisper grew louder, crawling into her ears, into her skull. She dreamed of hands clawing at the inside of the well, fingernails peeling away, bones snapping, mouths stitched shut, yet still screaming. She woke just before dawn, and someone was standing over her. It was Sophia, or what was left of her. Skin waterlogged, lips torn open, her voice nothing more than a whisper of a whisper. "She's waiting." The descent Lucia knew what had to be done. The well wasn't calling them, it was keeping them. The village didn't want visitors. It wanted witnesses. She tied a rope around her waist, ignoring Ben's protests, and climbed over the edge. The descent was slower than she expected. The walls slick with something thicker than water, the air turning colder the deeper she went. The whispers became louder, echoing off the stone, until they formed a chorus. 1,000 voices, praying and cursing and pleading all at once. Then the rope jerked. The forgotten room at the bottom of the well. She found a door, ancient, covered in symbols carved so deeply they seemed to bleed. The wood pulsed beneath her hand like living skin. She pushed it open. Inside was a room lined with mirrors, each one showing a different version of her, older, younger, missing, dead. In the center of the room stood the doll, its stitches undone, its mouth open wide enough for a scream, but no sound came. Lucia stepped forward. The door slammed shut. The bargain Catalina waited inside. A child and a ghost and a curse all at once. Her skin was cracked porcelain, her voice a whisper made of dust. In her hands she held a key, rusted and slick. "Take my place," Catalina whispered. "Or join them." Lucia looked into the mirrors. Every face she saw was someone who once stood where she stood, each one a sacrifice to keep the village asleep. She took the key. The surface lies when Lucia emerged from the well. Dawn was breaking. Ben and Elias pulled her up, relief flooding their faces. But something was wrong. Lucia didn't speak. Lucia didn't blink. And her reflection, caught in the puddle beside the well, still had sewn lips. The price of knowing the villagers faded back into the fog, their dolls crumbling into dirt and bone. The well stood quiet again, its debt temporarily paid. But the whispers never truly stop. Lucia knew this now. The well remembers, and so does she. The final page before leaving the village, Elias opened the journal one last time. A new page had appeared, blank except for a single line written in fresh blood. "She sings still." The Forgotten Village, Episode 3. The widow sang the song no one sang before the village vanished, before the earth swallowed its name. There was a song only one woman knew, a song no mother dared sing to her child, a lullaby so heavy with sorrow that even the wind held its breath when it played. They called her La Viuda Cantante, the singing widow, and her voice was the first thing Lucia heard when they woke on their third cursed morning in the village. A voice from nowhere, it started soft, blending with the mist, humming through the cracked windows and broken roofs. The melody felt old, like something passed down through tongues too frightened to speak it clearly. It was both familiar and completely foreign, like a prayer learned in a past life. Lucia recognized it immediately. She had heard her grandmother hum it in her sleep when she was a child. And now, here it was, bleeding through the walls of the forgotten village. The widow's house at the northern edge of the village stood the widow's house, a place even the fog seemed to avoid. Its walls were warped with moisture and time, its windows shattered inward, as though something had tried to escape from within. Lucia, Elias, and Ben stood at its threshold, unwilling to step inside, yet unable to walk away. The song curled through the cracks in the wood, sweet and mournful, carrying the weight of 100 broken promises. On the door, someone had scratched words into the wood, deep enough to splinter the grain. "Leave her alone." The first night she sang, the journal had mentioned her, not by name, but as the woman who knew too much. She had been a bride once, before her husband was taken by the curse. After his disappearance, she sang every night by the well, her voice the only sound the village allowed after dark, until one night her song stopped. They found her the next morning, sitting in her rocking chair, veil covering her face, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her mouth was gone, skin smooth where her lips should be, as though someone had sung her voice out of her. Inside the widow's house they stepped inside, boots sinking into the damp wood, air thick with the smell of wet silk and decay. The furniture remained untouched, draped in sheets so thin they clung like cobwebs. On the mantel, an unlit candle sat beside a photograph, the only one not burned or cracked. It showed a young woman, veiled in white, standing beside an empty space where her groom should have been. The song began again, not from the air, but from the floor beneath them. The song beneath the floor. Lucia knelt, ear pressed to the wood. The melody drifted up through the cracks, muffled but clear, as though the house itself was singing. Each note carried something wet with it, not water, but a memory, soaked and wrung out. They peeled back the boards, hands shaking, nails splintering the edges, until they found the veil. It lay folded carefully, tied with a length of black thread, soaked through with something darker than water. When Lucia lifted it, the singing stopped, and in the silence, a whisper came, "Don't wake her." The bride beneath the veil lay a face. Not bone, not flesh, but something in between. The widow's face was pressed into the earth, skin paper-thin, eyes sewn shut, mouth sealed with the same black thread that held her veil. Yet somehow she had still been singing. Elias staggered back, hand over his mouth, while rising in his throat. Ben swore under his breath, backing toward the door, but Lucia couldn't move. The widow's face was smiling. The missing groom in the far corner of the room stood the widow's wedding dress, still hanging where she left it, though the fabric was stained red at the hem. Inside one of its pockets, they found a letter, folded so many times the edges had fused together. Lucia pried it open. "He came for him, not me. He took my voice instead. The well remembers who sang first." The silent procession returns that night. The shadows returned. The same sewn-mouth figures they had seen before, standing shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the village. But this time, they held candles, and from every candle dripped blood. They were not here for Elias. They were not here for Ben. They were here for Lucia because she had held the veil, because she had heard the song, because now the village knew her voice. The widow walks long after midnight. Lucia woke to find the veil wrapped around her hands, soaked through as though she had been holding it in her sleep. The song hummed inside her chest, vibrating in her bones, moving her lips without permission. In the mirror, her reflection stood still, mouth sewn shut, eyes filled with earth. And standing beside her was the widow, hand outstretched. The lullaby ritual in the journal's final pages. They found the ritual, the one the villagers performed every year to silence the widow's song. They would dress a girl in the veil, sit her beside the well, and make her sing until dawn. If the song never stopped, the village was safe. If the girl fell silent, the well would open. The final song. Lucia sat at the well's edge, veil over her face, voice trembling as she sang the melody the widow had left behind. The villagers watched from the mist, candles flickering in the fog, mouths sealed, but eyes wide with hunger. The well breathed beneath her, earth rising and falling like a sleeping beast. The water turned dark, reflecting not the sky, but the widow's smile. The song faltered, and the well opened. The widow's return from the dark water rose the dress, its red-stained hem curling over the edge. Then came the veil, trailing behind a figure wrapped in silk and earth, her mouth finally open, her voice flowing freely after decades of silence. The widow sang the song herself, and every candle went out. The price of silence. By morning, Lucia was gone. In her place sat the widow's chair, veil folded neatly on the seat, and beside it, a new photograph. It showed Lucia, dressed as the bride, standing beside an empty space where her groom should have been. The final whisper as they fled the village, Elias and Ben heard the song one last time, soft and distant, carried on the mist. And with it came the whisper, "Sing for me." The Forgotten Village, Episode 4. The child who never grew up. A story only the dead remember. Every cursed village has a ghost story. But the Forgotten Village had a story no one dared tell. A story about a child who never grew old, never left, and never truly lived. They called her La Nina Perdida, the lost child, but the truth was far darker. She wasn't lost. She was left behind. The playground in the fog, it was Ben who saw it first. A rusted swing set, half buried in the earth, chains swaying even though the air was dead still. There was no playground marked on any map, no mention of it in the journal. Yet there it was, waiting, as though it had always known they would come. A single doll sat on one of the swings, its face cracked porcelain, its eyes missing. Lucia had vanished the night before. They were two now, Elias and Ben, and both knew the village wasn't done with them. The laughter that never ends, soft laughter, echoed through the mist. A child's giggle, high and breathless, as though it had forgotten how to breathe, came from nowhere and everywhere, a sound without source. Ben whispered, "Lucia," but deep down he knew it wasn't her. The girl who stayed 5, the journal spoke of her only once, in a crossed-out entry, scrawled in ink so faint it was nearly invisible. She turned 5, and she stayed 5. Even when we buried her. The birthday that never came, the villagers, the ones who had vanished in 1937, had a tradition. Every child, on their 5th birthday, would receive a doll handmade by the mothers. It was a blessing, they said, to guard them as they grew. But one child, her name wiped from the journal, had no mother. Her doll was made by the earth itself, stitched with hair found tangled in tree roots, stuffed with moss pulled from the well stones. She held it so tightly on her birthday, her fingers broke. That night, her heart stopped, and by morning, she was playing outside again. The house with the small door, they followed the laughter to the smallest house in the village, a crooked structure barely taller than a man's waist, its door built for someone no taller than a child. Ben knelt to open it, and the door swung wide, creaking like old lungs collapsing. Inside, everything was perfectly preserved. Tiny furniture, a tea set with cups still filled, a bed with a doll-sized body tucked beneath the covers, and hanging on the wall, a birthday banner that read, "Forever 5. The child in the mirror, Elias, lifted the teacup, and the liquid inside rippled without touch. The cracked mirror beside the bed flickered. In its reflection stood a little girl, wearing a dress stitched from rags, her hair braided with roots, her face a perfect mask of skin stretched too tight. She smiled, and from her mouth spilled dirt. The games she plays, the floorboards shifted beneath their feet, and the entire house breathed, wood bending like ribs, windows fogging with moisture that smelled like wet leaves and decay. The girl whispered, "Play with me." Ben took a step back, but the doorway was gone. Only walls, smooth and pulsing like skin stretched over bone, surrounded them now. The only way out was to play. The rules of the game, the girl's rules, appeared in the mirror, written backwards in a hand that shook. Find my doll. Find my voice. Find my heart. If they lost, they would stay forever, just like her. The doll hunt, the first task, led them to the well, where the doll's head bobbed on the surface. Its eyes were still missing, but its mouth had been sewn shut with red thread. Ben reached for it, and the water grabbed his wrist. Tiny hands, dozens of them, gripping tight, nails bitten to the quick, skin peeling away. The hands of children who had played this game before and lost. The voice buried in the earth, the second task, took them to the tree at the village's edge, the one that bled when cut. Beneath its roots, wrapped in cloth soaked black, they found a tongue, still twitching. Elias gagged. The tongue whispered, "Thank you." The heart that wasn't hers, the final piece, waited in the widow's house. The heart, nailed to the door, still beating though it had long turned to stone. It wasn't the girl's heart. It was the heart of the first child ever born in the village. Elias tore it free, and the whole house screamed. The child's revenge, they brought the pieces back to the small house, laid them on the tiny table, and waited. The girl appeared again, but she was older now, her face stretched grotesque, her hands too long, her smile too wide. "You found them." She gathered the pieces in her arms, held them close, and for a moment, she almost looked at peace. Then she looked at Ben and Elias and said, "Now it's your turn." Forever 5, the floor collapsed and they fell into a room full of children, each one no older than 5, each one holding a doll with their own face sewn on. Lucia was there too. She didn't speak. Her mouth was gone. The escape they didn't earn, they ran. Through walls that bent to trap them, past mirrors that showed them already buried, through air that tasted like damp silk and breath held too long. When they reached the village edge, the girl stood blocking their way, her smile splitting her face in half. "Play again tomorrow?" she asked. Then she stepped aside, and they ran. The village remembers when they turned back at the top of the hill, the village was gone, swallowed in fog, like it had never been there. But the doll Ben carried, the one they found in the well, it still whispered her song. Because the village always remembers its children, and no one ever truly leaves. The Forgotten Village, Episode 5. The cursed feast, a table set for the dead. They knew the village was cursed. They knew the well whispered. They knew no one ever left whole. But none of them expected the village to invite them to dinner. It happened at dusk, just as the fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the houses. The bell in the abandoned chapel, rusted silent for decades, rang once. And then the scent came: roasted meat, spiced wine, fresh bread. But beneath it all was something rotting, a sweetness too sharp, a perfume made of death wearing a mask of celebration. On the village square, beneath the twisted branches of the blood tree, stood a table, set for 4. The feast that never ends, the journal had warned them, in a trembling script barely legible beneath years of smudged ink. Do not eat at the table. The village remembers hunger. The feast never ends. But hunger is a beast that ignores warnings. After 3 days lost in the village, their supplies were gone. Their stomachs burned with emptiness. And the food, steaming, fragrant, sat waiting. Lucia was gone. Sophia was gone. It was only Ben and Elias now. And the village was watching. The ghost hosts as they approached. Shadows shifted at the edges of the square. Villagers, or what was left of them, standing just out of focus. Their faces were wrong, mouths stretched too wide, hands clasped in silent prayer. Each held a plate. Each plate held a piece of themselves. A tongue, an ear, a severed finger, a piece of scalp with hair still attached. They smiled and waited. The first bite, Ben, always the skeptic, grabbed a piece of bread. It was warm, soft, exactly how his grandmother used to bake it. For a moment, it tasted like home. Then the taste changed, sour, metallic, like biting into raw flesh. The bread pulsed in his hand, and when he dropped it, it landed on the dirt like a severed heart, still beating. He vomited, but the villagers clapped. A silent, broken applause, hands striking hands without sound, skin splitting open with each clap. The feast had begun. The seats that choose you, Elias tried to step back, but the chair behind him moved, slamming into his knees. Ben's did the same. They were invited, and in the Forgotten Village, an invitation was a command. They sat. The plates filled themselves with things they recognized. Elias saw his mother's soup, her famous broth with rosemary and bone marrow. Ben's plate held his birthday cake from when he was 7, perfectly replicated, down to the smudged icing. But beneath each dish, something glistened: teeth. Not animal, not human, something older. The feast that remembers, the journal had called it the Feast of the Returning Dead, a ritual meant to feed the village itself. Every meal consumed at this table was not eaten, but taken. Each bite gave the village a memory, a part of the eater's soul. It was how the village grew strong enough to survive death. No one ate for nourishment. They ate to become part of the village. The missing guests, 4 seats, but only 2 of them sat. The other 2 plates filled slowly, one with Lucia's favorite meal, the other with Sophia's last dinner before they entered the village. The village hadn't forgotten them, because they were still here, just not whole anymore. The dancing bones with the first bite taken, the ground beneath the table shifted. Bones, small, child-sized, slick with earth and ancient rot, rose up like fingers, curling around the table legs. The villagers stepped forward, their bodies moving like puppets, joints cracking, heads tilting too far to the side. They began to dance, a silent, boneless waltz that matched the rhythm of Ben's racing heart. With every step they took, the food on the table aged, rotting before their eyes, turning black, writhing with maggots. But the plates never emptied. The voices beneath the table when Elias dropped his spoon. It rolled beneath the tablecloth. He knelt to retrieve it and found himself face to face with something watching him from below. Dozens of faces, pressed into the earth beneath the table, eyes wide, mouths sewn shut. The previous guests, each of them still chewing, though their mouths were long stitched closed. Elias screamed, and one of the faces opened its mouth wide enough to tear the stitches apart. "Join us!" The blood toast, the wine glasses lifted on their own, hovering before Ben and Elias. The villagers raised their own cups, not filled with wine, but with teeth floating in dark liquid. Ben slapped the glass away, and the villagers hissed, mouths opening impossibly wide, tongues split like serpents. Elias, trembling, took the glass, and his reflection stared back at him from the wine. Only it was older, mouthless, eyes hollow. When he drank, he tasted every death the village had ever known. The meal they couldn't refuse, the plates wouldn't let them go. Every time they pushed the food away, the chairs pulled them back. Every rejection made the shadows closer, the villagers' smiles wider, their hands outstretched. The food was no longer food. Ben's plate held his own face, eyes blinking, mouth screaming silently. Elias' plate held his heart, still beating, wrapped in the pages of the journal. They had to finish the meal, or become the next course. The price of hunger they ate. With every bite, memories bled from their eyes, childhood birthdays, first loves, last goodbyes, each one devoured by the village itself. The more they ate, the less they remembered who they were. By the end, they were strangers to themselves. But the villagers applauded, and the earth sighed in satisfaction. The last dish, when the plates were empty, the table itself opened, splitting down the center like a mouth. Inside, wrapped in linen, lay Lucia. Not dead, not alive, her lips sewn shut, her hands folded over her chest. Her heart was missing, because Elias had eaten it. The feast never ends, they ran. But the village had already taken its payment. They would never taste real food again, only dirt and ashen blood, no matter where they went. And whenever they closed their eyes, they would hear the bell, calling them back, because once you eat at the cursed feast, you are always hungry. The Forgotten Village, Episode 6. The path that loops the road they couldn't leave, they tried to leave at dawn. Ben and Elias, pale, hollow-eyed, stomachs still turning from the cursed feast, stumbled to the village gate. Fog curled thick around their ankles, the path barely visible beneath a carpet of wet leaves and bones too small to belong to animals. The map showed one road in, one road out, but the village had its own map, and it had forgotten how to let go. The first loop they walked in silence, afraid to speak, the fear growing between them. The mist swallowed sound anyway. After 30 minutes, the path should have led to the first ridge, the landmark that told them they were leaving the village behind. Instead, they stood once again in the center of the square. The cursed table was gone. The well stood silent, but the village was watching. The trail that fought back, they tried again, this time cutting through the forest instead of following the main path. Branches clawed at their clothes, brambles tore skin from bone. The trees pressed in too tight, the air too thin. And then they saw themselves, walking the path ahead of them, clothes torn, skin bleeding, but slightly older. The forest had repeated them. They chased their own shadows until the forest spat them back into the village square. The Forgotten Gate, every village has an entrance, but this village had no exit. They circled the perimeter, searching for anything. A break in the trees, a crack in the earth, even the faintest animal trail. But the edges of the village were seamless. blending into the mist like the world itself had forgotten to end. And there, hanging from a tree at what should have been the gate, was a sign, carved into wood so old the letters had melted into the grain. Only those who forget may leave. The memory told the journal, damp and torn from the previous night, whispered its secrets when Elias flipped its pages with trembling hands. The village does not keep you by force. It keeps you by memory. The only way out is to forget why you came. Forget the village. Forget the well. Forget the feast. Forget Lucia. The voices in the fog, but the village remembered them. Every step they took outside the square, the fog spoke. Not in words, but in memories. Elias saw his mother's hands, pale and trembling, folding his clothes when he was 10. Ben heard his father's voice, calling him home for dinner. Each memory led them deeper into the mist. Each step replaced reality with memory. The cabin that shouldn't exist after hours of walking, they found a cabin. A place neither of them remembered seeing before. Its roof was caved in, its walls scrawled with names. Each scratched deep into the wood with fingernails instead of knives. Some names had been crossed out. Some had no end date. Lucia's name was there, still fresh, the wood beneath her name wet with blood. The woman with no face inside the cabin sat a figure, wrapped in cloth, veil covering her head, hands folded neatly in her lap. She rocked gently in a chair, singing the widow's song, but without lips, without teeth, just sound from nothing. Elias stepped closer. She lifted her head. Her face was smooth skin, stretched tight across bone, no features at all, just a surface that remembered being human. And from her faceless mouth came a whisper, "Forget or stay." The price of forgetting the journal had lied. Forgetting was not freedom. It was a trade. To leave the village, they had to give up their memories, not just of the village, but of themselves. Forget your name. Forget your past. Forget why you ever came here. The village could only release what no longer exists. The loop tightens, they ran. Faster than their bodies could handle, lungs burning, hearts pounding. The village edge should have been there, but every turn led them back to the square. The blood tree stood taller each time they returned, its branches now heavy with dolls, each one with their faces stitched on. Lucia's doll hung the highest, and from the well came her voice, calling them back. The test the village spoke directly now, through the cracks in the earth, through the fog itself, through the veins inside their own skin. It asked a single question, "What is your name?" Ben opened his mouth and nothing came out. The village had already started to take. The door that wasn't there as night fell, the earth split beneath the well, revealing a staircase spiraling down. The journal had one final page, one no ink had touched before. The only way out is through. They descended into the earth's throat, into the village's belly, into the memory graveyard where every forgotten soul had been buried. The chamber of names at the bottom was a hall lined with doors, each marked with a name. Some names were ancient, some were their own handwriting. One door stood open, Lucia's door. Inside, they found her voice, trapped in a jar filled with dark water. It whispered, "Take me home." The final bargain to leave, they had to trade one name for another. Lucia could leave if one of them stayed. One memory must anchor the curse. Elias whispered his own name into the jar, watching as the water turned red, his voice joining hers. The door slammed shut. The loop breaks at dawn. Ben woke outside the village. Alone, clothes torn, hands stained with earth, but memories of the village gone. He remembered only a single name, Lucia. The path reappears, the road was there now, clear, straight, leading back to the world. No fog, no shadows, but the well still whispered behind him, because Elias was still inside, and the village always needs a name to hold on to. The final page days later, when Ben returned home, a package waited at his door. The journal, sealed in black wax, with a new entry in handwriting he didn't recognize. The village remembers, even if you forget. The Forgotten Village, Episode 7. The possessed bride, the dress that waited the first morning after Ben escaped the village. A wedding dress appeared on his doorstep. It wasn't folded neatly in a box or hanging from a hook. It stood upright, as though an invisible bride already wore it. The veil draped like skin torn from a face, the lace soaked in mud and something darker. Pinned to the chest was a note, written in trembling script, smudged with blood. "She's waiting for her groom." Ben didn't remember proposing to anyone. He barely remembered his own name, but the village hadn't forgotten him. The bride without a name, the journal had mentioned her only once. In the section so damaged by water and ash, most words were unreadable. But one line stood out, carved deeper into the paper. "The bride doesn't need a name, only a groom." Ben burned the dress that night. By dawn, it was back on his doorstep, perfectly clean. The first dream, the first time she came to him, was in sleep. He stood in the village square, the sky twisted into a rotting sunset, the well overflowing with red water. She stood beside the well, the bride, veil hiding her face, hands folded over her heart. In her hands, she held a ring, not gold or silver, but bone, carved into a perfect circle. She lifted her veil. Her face was Lucia's. The bride walks the next night. Ben locked his door, boarded his windows, burned sage until his lungs ached. At exactly midnight, the boards peeled away, nails twisting out of the wood like fingers unscrewing themselves. The window swung open, and outside, beneath the flickering streetlight, stood the bride. This time, her veil was missing. Her mouth was sewn shut, and yet, Ben could still hear her whisper, "Come home." The bride's history, Elias' journal, now resting beside Ben's bed, had changed. New pages had appeared, pages Elias never wrote, written in a hand neither of them knew. They told her story. The bride was the firstborn daughter of the village's founder, promised not to a man, but to the land itself. Her wedding was not to unite families, but to seal a pact. On her wedding night, she was led to the well, where her groom waited. But there was no groom. There was only the village itself, hungry and waiting. She stepped into the well in her wedding dress, and never stepped out. The wedding that never ends. Since that night, the village had performed the ritual every generation, dressing a new girl in the cursed gown, leading her to the well, marrying her to the earth. But when the village vanished, the bride was left without a ceremony. No groom ever came. Now she wandered, searching for anyone who remembered the village, anyone who had set foot inside. She had chosen Ben. The veil that clings no matter how far he ran, the dress followed. He left it in hotel rooms, in dumpsters, buried it in fields. By the time he returned, it was always there, back on his bed or waiting at the foot of it, standing like a corpse prepared for burial. Ben stopped sleeping, but the dreams still found him. The silent procession the fourth night, the villagers came, the ones with mouths sewn shut, the ones who danced around the cursed feast. They stood in a circle outside his motel room, holding candles that burned with black flame. At the center stood the bride. This time, she held not just a ring, but a noose braided from her own hair. The groom's invitation the next morning, Ben's phone rang. An unknown number. When he answered, there was no voice, only the sound of wedding bells ringing from underwater. The caller ID read, "The Forgotten Village." He smashed the phone. It rang again from inside the broken screen. The mirror vows by the fifth day, his reflection no longer followed him. When Ben looked into any mirror, his reflection stood still, dressed in a tattered wedding suit, mouth sewn shut, eyes filled with earth. The reflection raised its hand and pointed to the nearest door. When Ben opened it, it led not outside, but back into the village square. The well ceremony the village had returned for him, folding itself into the world like a memory too stubborn to die. The well stood open, and the villagers stood ready, the bride in her place, veil trailing in the dirt, arms outstretched. In her hands, she held a heart. It was still beating. Ben's name was carved into it. The groom accepts there was no choice left. The village had chosen him. The bride had waited long enough. He stepped forward, took the heart from her hands, and placed the ring of bone on his finger. The villagers clapped silently, their hands breaking apart with the force of it. The bride lifted her veil. Her face was a perfect mask of every woman Ben had ever loved, stitched together into one impossible smile. The wedding night, the bride led him to the well, hand in hand, steps perfectly in sync. The villagers sang, though their mouths never opened. The song filled the air, vibrating through the earth itself. At the edge of the well, Ben looked down. At the bottom, Elias stood, waiting in a suit made of roots and bones, holding a mirror. Ben saw his own reflection, dressed as the groom, mouth sewn shut, eyes missing. The bride whispered her vows, though her lips never moved. I take you to hold and bury, in sickness and in soil, until memory do us part. The final step, she stepped into the well. Ben followed. The water closed over their heads, but they did not sink. They became part of the earth, swallowed and rewritten. Memories fed into the village itself. The village sighed, full, but not satisfied. It never is. The morning after at dawn, the well was gone. The village square stood empty. But miles away, in a town where no one remembered the forgotten village, a wedding dress appeared on someone's doorstep. The veil was still wet, and the cycle began again. The Forgotten Village, Episode 8. Faces in the fog that remembers Ben was gone. Lucia was gone. Elias was the last one left, or at least the last one who still remembered his own name. But the village wasn't done with him. On the morning after the wedding, when Ben and the bride disappeared into the well, the village filled with fog, thicker than breath, colder than morning, crawling through the broken windows like fingers made of bone dust. Inside the fog were faces. The village breathes. Elias stood in the middle of the square, staring into the mist, heart hammering in his chest. The village no longer felt abandoned. It breathed, each building inhaling fog through cracked doors and shattered glass. And in every window, in every puddle, in every reflection, there were faces. Some he recognized, Lucia, Ben, Sophia, but others were strangers. Old women with rotting veils, children with mouths filled with dirt, men with hands worn down to bone and blood. The village was showing him every soul it had ever swallowed, and they were watching him. The fog's whisper. The fog didn't move like normal mist. It followed him, clinging to his ankles, curling around his wrists, slipping beneath his skin like a second bloodstream. When he walked, the fog whispered in his own voice, repeating things he had said days before. His arguments with Ben, his desperate prayers to leave, his whispered apologies to Lucia. The fog had listened. Now it was answering. The forgotten faces. The journal had warned about the fog. A single line scratched into the margins, barely visible beneath layers of smeared ink. When the fog comes, do not look at their faces. But how could he not? Every step he took, a face turned to follow. Eyes too wide, mouths too narrow, skin stretched over expressions that didn't belong to the living. They weren't ghosts. They were memories made flesh. The path that moves. He tried to find the road, the same road that had vanished before. But the fog had rewritten it. Every path led back to the square. Every turn twisted into another version of the same street. The village was folding itself, like a hand closing around a fragile insect. And every time he retraced his steps, the faces were closer. The eyes of the well. The fog led him to the well, because of course it did. The well was the village's eye, the place where the earth opened wide enough to see. He stared into its depths. The water was gone. In its place was a reflection of the sky, but not the sky above. A sky filled with faces, pressed together like corpses piled in a mass grave, staring up at him. And beneath their faces was his own. The girl in the mist. She stepped out of the fog like a memory he had tried to bury. A girl no older than 10, dress torn, hair matted with blood and earth. Her face was blank, like a doll before the eyes are painted on. But her voice was Lucia's. "You left me." Elias staggered back, but the girl followed, bare feet dragging through mud, leaving no footprints. "You left all of us." The village speaks. The fog thickened, and the faces spoke as one. Not with words, but with memories, flooding into Elias' mind like water bursting through a dam. He saw the first sacrifice, a girl led to the well with her hands tied in front of her, her parents too afraid to cry. He saw the cursed feast, villagers eating their own memories until they forgot their own names. He saw Lucia's reflection, standing in a mirror that no longer existed, mouth sewn shut with red thread. And beneath it all, he saw himself, the final outsider, the last one who still remembered the way in. The mirror gate. The fog guided him back to the widow's house, where the mirror still stood, cracked but alive, its surface rippling like water. In the reflection stood every face the village had taken, pressed together like a mosaic made of lost souls. Elias stepped closer, and the mirror reached back. Hundreds of hands pressing against the glass from the inside, fingers scratching for freedom. And in the center, framed by all the others, was Lucia. She whispered one word: "Run." The fog's hunger. The fog thickened into hands, grabbing at his ankles, pulling him back toward the well. Each face merged into his own, memories mixing until Elias couldn't tell where he ended and the village began. The village didn't want to kill him. It wanted to wear him. A new face for the fog, a new voice to whisper its secrets, a new memory to keep it fed. The road that bleeds desperate. Elias closed his eyes and ran. Not toward the gate, not toward the road, but toward the only place the fog seemed to fear: the shrine. The place where the first bride had made her vow, where the first child had disappeared, where the first curse was written into the earth. The shrine was bleeding, dark liquid seeping from the wood, letters changing beneath his hands, rearranging themselves into a warning: "Every face becomes yours." The faces beneath his skin. Elias felt his own face shifting, skin rippling like water, features stretching into someone else's smile, someone else's fear. The fog wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside him. Every blink showed a different memory. Ben's hands clutching his throat, Sophia's eyes filling with dirt, Lucia's fingers reaching for his as she sank beneath the well. The village wasn't trapping him. It was becoming him. The final bargain. At the center of the shrine stood a mirror, freshly cleaned, no cracks, no stains. It showed his face, and beside him the girl from the fog. She held out her hand. In her palm was a knife carved from bone, and beside it, a folded scrap of cloth soaked in old blood. "Cut your face away," she whispered, "or the village will wear it forever." The skin offering with trembling hands, Elias took the knife. He carved away his reflection, peeling his face from the mirror like paper. Blood ran down the glass, but beneath it was nothing. No skin, no bone, just fog. He pressed the scrap of skin into the girl's hand. She smiled with his own mouth, and the fog retreated. The empty road at dawn, the fog was gone. The village stood empty, silent, the well covered in ivy and dirt. The road appeared, clear, open, leading out of the village. Elias followed it, but when he reached the first ridge, he looked into a puddle beside the path. The reflection staring back wasn't his own. It was every face the village had ever taken, stitched together into a mask that looked almost human. The village always remembers Elias left the village that day, but the fog followed, curling around his footsteps, whispering beneath his breath. In every mirror, in every window, in every drop of rain, the faces stared back. Because the village never lets go. It only learns to wear you better. The Forgotten Village, Episode 9. Blood Tree. The tree that never died. In the center of the forgotten village stood a tree, taller than any house, older than the first graves, its bark the color of dried blood. No leaves ever grew from its branches. No birds dared perch there. But at midnight, the tree would bleed. Not sap, not rainwater, Blood. Elias saw it himself the night he returned. The same night the fog whispered his name and the earth remembered his footsteps. The tree stood like a guardian at the heart of the village, its roots burrowing deep into forgotten bodies. Beneath its branches lay the bones of every broken vow, every betrayed child, every soul the village ever swallowed. And now the tree knew his name too. The first cut the journal had mentioned the tree only once. In an entry written so faintly, it was almost invisible. Cut the tree, and it will show you the truth. Drink from the tree, and it will show you yourself. Elias didn't want to see either. But the village had a way of offering things you never asked for. The sap that screamed that night, the wind carried a sound thin, sharp, like a child's cry being pulled through a keyhole. It came from the tree, from the wounds carved into its bark. Elias stepped closer. Each knot in the wood was a face, twisted, screaming, mouths open wide, but frozen forever in silence. Their eyes followed him, tracking every breath. The tree was a graveyard standing upright. And every face belonged to someone who had tried to leave. The curse rooted deep. The villagers had planted the tree themselves, or so the journal said. Not as a monument, not for shade, but as a gate. The first sacrifice had been buried beneath it, a child born during a blood moon, wrapped in a veil meant for a bride, and her heart removed before her first breath. They planted the tree in her chest. Her blood fed the roots. Her memories became the soil. The offer they couldn't refuse. Elias didn't touch the tree, but it touched him. Roots curling up from the earth, slick with moisture that smelled like copper and rain, wrapping around his ankles. It was hungry. It wanted to remember him from the inside. The red rain at midnight, the tree wept. Blood seeped from every crack, running down the bark like tears, pooling at its base until the dirt was too wet to stand on. The blood didn't drip. It crawled, defying gravity, tracing symbols into the air. Letters formed names: Lucia, Sophia, Ben, and at the very bottom, Elias. The tree had claimed them all. The faces in the bark, he saw them then. Faces pressed into the wood, some half-swallowed, some still trying to scream, lips stretched into silence. Hands reached out, fingers broken, bones fused with the grain. Each face was a memory the village refused to forget. Each root was a vein, pulsing with stolen blood. The ceremony of the roots in the journal's back pages, the ones that shouldn't exist, Elias found instructions for a ritual called the root ceremony. It was the only way to leave. To break free, he had to feed the tree something stronger than blood. A memory so deep it would anchor the curse into the wood itself. Cut your past from your skin. Bury it at the tree's roots. Drink from the wound. Only then could he leave. But the cost was everything he had ever been. The knife from the well, the knife waited for him. Half buried in mud beside the well, its blade rusted but still sharp enough to remember. The handle was wrapped in hair, Lucia's hair, or Sophia's, or maybe both. He took it. The tree sighed, wood creaking, branches bending low like it was watching him closely. The earth remembered this ceremony. The offering of flesh. Elias stood at the base of the tree, knife trembling in his hand. He pressed the blade to his palm, slicing deep enough for blood to drip freely. The tree drank greedily, bark splitting open to form a mouth, roots curling up like hands desperate to hold him still. He pressed his childhood photograph into the wound, the only picture his mother ever took, his name scrawled on the back. The tree swallowed it whole, and then it spoke. The voice of the earth. The voice came not from the tree, but from inside Elias' own chest, words vibrating in his ribs, twisting in his lungs. Now I know you. Now you are mine. The blood on his palm turned black, veins darkening up his arm, memories pouring out of him like water from a cracked cup. He saw his mother's hands fold into nothing. He saw his childhood home collapse into fog. He saw his own face fade from every memory. The tree didn't set him free. It ate him whole from the inside out. The memory drink. The final step was to drink from the tree, to consume the blood it had stolen, to replace what had been taken with what the village remembered instead. He cupped his hands beneath the bark. The blood was warm, too warm, and thicker than it should have been. It tasted like mud and prayers forgotten halfway through, like a scream bitten off before it could escape. As he drank, the world shuddered. The new route by dawn, the fog lifted, the village stood empty, the tree stood taller, and beneath its roots, a new face appeared. Elias' face, mouth open wide, eyes filled with dirt, frozen mid-scream. Because the village doesn't let you leave, plants you deeper. The village reborn Elias walked away, but he wasn't Elias anymore. His face was the same, his voice was the same, but his memories belonged to the village now. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tree, taller than before, its roots searching for new names, new voices, new faces. The forgotten village was no longer forgotten, because now it remembered him perfectly. The Forgotten Village, Episode 10. The forbidden ritual, the ritual no one spoke of before the village disappeared, before the earth swallowed every footprint. There was one ritual even the bravest elder refused to mention. A ritual so old, so wrong, that even the earth itself shuddered when it was performed. They called it La Ceremonia Prohibita, the forbidden ceremony. A ritual designed not to appease the curse, but to command it. The cost? A soul not yet born. The door beneath the earth. Elias stood alone now. Lucia was gone. Ben was gone. The fog had swallowed everyone but him. He stood at the center of the village, the earth breathing beneath his feet, and in his hand lay the final page of the journal, a page no one had dared to read aloud. It described a door, buried deep beneath the roots of the blood tree, sealed with bone and ash, locked with the heartbeat of the first bride. A door that led to the origin of the curse. And to open it, he had to finish the ritual they began generations ago, the ritual they abandoned out of fear. The well that waited the village had rearranged itself. The well stood closer to the tree now, and the tree's roots curled over its edge like fingers, dipping into the dark water. Elias stepped closer. The water wasn't water anymore. It was blood, still warm, reflecting not his face, but every face the village had ever taken. Lucia's was there. So was Sophia's. Even his own, except his mouth was sewn shut in the reflection. And the reflection whispered, "Open the door." The song of the bones, the ritual required a song. Not a hymn, not a prayer, but a lullaby sung in reverse, words meant to unwind time, to undo memory. The journal only gave the first line, "Sleep beneath, sleep within. Wake only when the earth forgets your name." The rest was missing, torn from the page, swallowed by time. But the bones remembered. Beneath the tree, the earth began to sing. A chorus of voices long buried, children, mothers, fathers, all singing the forbidden lullaby backwards. Their jaws creaked open, dirt spilling from their teeth, words vibrating through shattered skulls. Elias knelt, pressing his ear to the earth. He learned the song from the dead themselves. The blood key, the second part of the ritual, required a key, not metal, but bone carved from the village's first victim. Elias dug at the base of the blood tree, fingers clawing through damp soil, until he found a ribcage no larger than a child's toy. Etched into the bone were words no one should write. "With this key, I open memory. With this key, I open blood. With this key, I bind my own soul." The moment he spoke them, the bone bled in his hands, fresh, hot, as though the child it belonged to had just died. The sacrament of skin, the final step, required a sacrifice, not of life but of identity. The ritual demanded a face, peeled from the living, offered to the well as proof of willingness. Not just anyone's face, the face of the last to enter the village. Elias. The knife appeared at the well's edge, the same knife they found beside the widow's house, its handle wrapped in hair, its blade still slick with Ben's blood. He pressed it to his cheek and cut. The door opens his skin, once separated from his flesh, moved on its own, crawling across the ground like a living thing, sliding into the well. The water boiled, hissing words no human mouth could form, the surface cracking open like lips parting for a final breath. The earth split. Beneath the well, beneath the tree, beneath the village itself, lay a spiral staircase carved into bone, descending into blackness so deep it swallowed light. The door was open. Elias stepped through. The chamber of the first bride at the bottom was a room made entirely of teeth. Floor, walls, ceiling, all fused together, roots growing through molars, blood seeping from the cracks. At the center stood a bride. Not Catalina, not Lucia. The first bride, the one who never had a groom, the one married to the earth itself. Her veil was spun from human hair, her dress woven from shrouds stolen from the dead. Her hands were folded over her belly, which moved beneath her fingers. She was still pregnant with the first child the village ever gave to the curse. And the child was still alive. The true curse, the curse was never about appeasement. It was about birth. The village had been trying generation after generation to give birth to something that wasn't human. Something that could only exist if memory itself was severed from time. The bride opened her mouth. From her throat spilled voices, hundreds, all speaking at once, each voice belonging to someone the village had erased. The child is memory. The child is the village. The child is the curse. Elias understood too late. The curse wasn't a punishment. It was a birth ritual. The inversion, the bride stepped toward him, her belly splitting open, hands reaching out. A child's hands, skin smooth, nails sharp, eyes too old. The child climbed from her body, bones crackling into place, already whispering Elias' name. It knew him, because it was made from every memory the village had taken. A creature born from forgotten faces, swallowed prayers, lost names. The child was the village itself, reborn in flesh, and it wanted a father. The bargain of flesh, the child reached for Elias' hand. If he took it, he would become the new elder, keeper of the village, guardian of the curse, forever tied to the land. If he refused, the village would collapse into the earth, but take every soul it had ever touched with it, erasing them from existence itself, including Lucia, including Ben, including himself. The choice, he took the child's hand. The earth sighed, the well closed, the village stood empty once more, but beneath the soil the child grew. Elias was no longer Elias. He was the next stranger who would knock at the elder's door, the next bearer of the black box, the next voice to whisper, "Debt." The endless cycle when the next outsiders came, curious students, lost travelers, seekers of ghost stories. The village would open again. The well would whisper, the tree would bleed, the bride would wait. And at the center of it all stood Elias, wearing the face of every elder before him, his voice a chorus of all who came before, forever whispering, "Welcome to the Forgotten Village." The Forgotten Village, Episode 11. Keeper of Faces, a new face for the village. Elias no longer remembered his name. He stood at the edge of the square, coat too thin for the cold, hat pulled low enough to hide the emptiness beneath. His hands, no longer his hands, clutched a wooden box, sealed with black wax, its edges stained dark with something that smelled like forgotten rain and old blood. He had stood here before. He would stand here again, because the village needed a face. And now he was the keeper of faces. The first face, the village never forgets the first face it takes. It had belonged to Catalina, the girl who sang lullabies at her window before the well took her voice. Her face had been cut clean, pressed into the bark of the blood tree, her eyes wide open so they could watch every visitor who dared enter. Elias remembered carving her face free. He remembered how it screamed without sound. Now that face lived inside him, stretching beneath his skin, whispering through his teeth whenever he opened his mouth. Welcome to the village. The mask room beneath the blood tree, down the bone staircase where the first bride still slept. There was a room with no door, a room filled with masks, each one carved from the skin of a visitor. their memories sealed inside like insects caught in amber. Lucia's face was there. So was Ben's. So was Elias. Each time the village called for a new sacrifice, Elias would come here, choose a mask, and wear it until the village was satisfied. Each face brought new memories. Each memory made him less himself. The child and the keeper, the cursed child, the creature born from memory itself, the village made flesh, followed him everywhere. Its eyes held every sunset the village had ever swallowed, its smile wide enough to hold every scream ever silenced. "Who will we wear next?" the child asked. Elias didn't answer. He no longer had a voice of his own. The face offering at midnight, the blood tree bled thick, black sap running down its trunk, carving new names into the bark. A new visitor was coming. Somewhere, out there in the world, someone was already dreaming of the village, already hearing whispers in their sleep, already being invited. Elias knelt at the base of the tree, knife in hand, and whispered the ancient prayer, "Face for a face, memory for a memory. Come home." The earth shuddered beneath him. The village was hungry again. The mask that chose itself in the mask room. The faces began to twitch, skin rippling, mouths opening and closing, eyes rolling in empty sockets. One mask pulled free from the wall, landing at Elias' feet. It was his own face. Not the face he had now, but the face he wore before the village took him. The face of the man who first walked into the fog, clutching a journal, searching for friends already swallowed by the curse. The face before he became the keeper. The road that loops back with his old face in hand. Elias walked to the edge of the village, where the fog curled like smoke from a dying fire. The road stretched out before him, clear, inviting, almost normal. He knew better. The road always led back, but someone would follow it soon. Someone would see his face through the mist and think, "He looks familiar." That's how the village pulled you in, with faces you almost remembered. The visitor arrives just before dawn. She arrived. A woman young, but tired, eyes heavy with unslept nights, clothes wrinkled from too many hours on the road. Her GPS had stopped working hours ago. Her phone battery was dead. The village wasn't on her map, but the road had led her here anyway. Elias stood at the gate, box in hand, wearing his old face. He smiled the way humans smile, or tried to. Skin stretched wrong, teeth too white, eyes too empty. "Welcome," he said. "You've been here before." The price of a face. The woman's name was Clara. She had never heard of the village, but she knew the song, a lullaby her grandmother hummed when she was sick, a melody her mother forbade her to sing, a song that played in her dreams for years. The village had been calling her since before she was born, because her face belonged here. The procession at sunset, the villagers came, the ones with mouths sewn shut, the ones with eyes filled with dirt, the ones who had once stood where Clara stood now. They held a veil, spun from hair pulled from the earth, stained with tears shed by the first bride. They placed it over Clara's face. She didn't resist. The village had already worn her down. The keeper prepares in the mask room. Elias hung his old face back on the wall. It would rest there until the village needed it again. He took down Clara's face, even though she was still alive. He placed it over his own, skin cold, still damp, memory seeping into his veins. For the rest of the night, Elias would live her life, walk her footsteps, taste her regrets. Because the village couldn't just take faces. It had to wear them first. The marriage of memory at midnight, the blood tree opened. Clara stepped forward, veil trailing behind her, hands folded like a bride waiting at the altar. The villagers stood in a circle, humming the lullaby backwards, their sewn mouths stretching with each note. Elias stood beside her, now wearing her face, speaking with her voice, moving with her memories. Together they married the earth, and the village remembered her completely. The face forgotten by dawn, Clara was gone. Her car sat empty at the village edge, keys in the ignition, engine cold. No one would remember her. No one would look for her, because the village hadn't just taken her face. It had taken her place in the world. The keeper's curse. Elias returned to the square, face his own again, or at least the version the village allowed him to keep. The child waited, smile too wide, fingers still wet with blood from the ceremony. "Who will come next?" the child asked. Elias didn't answer, because the village already knew. The next face was already dreaming of the road, already hearing the song, already forgetting why they came. The village always needs faces. The village has no walls, no gate, no boundary you can cross. It exists only in memory. And every time someone remembers the lullaby, whispers the story, or wonders what happened to Catalina, the village opens its door just a little wider, and the keeper waits, because the village will always need faces. The final whisper. If you ever wake up humming a song you don't remember learning, a song no one taught you, stop, close your windows, burn your mirrors, and whatever you do, don't follow the road into the fog. Because if you do, you'll see him waiting. The man with a face you almost recognize, the keeper of faces. And once you see him, the village remembers you too. The Forgotten Village, Episode 12. The Bone Brides return the cracking earth. The village had been quiet for 3 days. Elias stood at the edge of the square, staring at the blood tree, watching the bark dry and split open like old skin. The roots, usually buried deep beneath the dirt, had begun to surface, curling across the ground like skeletal fingers, grasping at nothing. The earth was cracking too. Deep, narrow fissures that whispered if you stood too close. They whispered her name, La Novia de Huso, the Bone Bride, the first bride, the forgotten bride, the bride whose groom was the earth itself. And now she was waking up. The bride never left. The villagers always believed the first bride had died when the curse was first cast. Her body swallowed whole by the soil, her bones woven into the roots of the blood tree. But Elias knew the truth now. She never died. She became the village. Every path, every stone, every whisper of fog, every root and crack and splintered bone beneath his feet. It was all her. And now she wanted her face back. The face in the mirror. Elias stood in the widow's house, staring into the cracked mirror, waiting for his reflection to move. It always did, but this time it wasn't his face. It was hers, the bone bride. Skin stretched too thin, mouth sewn shut, veil shredded down the middle, leaving only her eyes uncovered. And in those eyes, Elias saw every face she had ever worn. Lucia, Ben, Sophia, Catalina, himself. They were all inside her now, part of her body, her memory, her curse. "You forgot me," she whispered through his reflection. "Now I will wear you all." The forgotten veil. The veil appeared at the foot of his bed that night, folded neatly, freshly washed, smelling of wet earth and old flowers. It wasn't made of cloth anymore. It was made of skin, stitched from every face the village had taken, sewn together with hair pulled from the well. Elias didn't want to touch it, but his hands moved on their own. The veil knew where it belonged. The well opens at midnight, the well breathed. The cover, a heavy stone no man could lift, slid aside like air, and from the darkness came her hand. Not flesh and bone, but root and memory. Fingers braided from the hair of every bride before her. She didn't climb out. She pulled the village down to her. The procession of the faceless, the villagers, the ones who had stood silent for generations, mouths sewn shut, eyes filled with dirt, gathered at the edge of the square. But this time their hands were empty. They no longer held candles. They no longer carried dolls. Each one carried their own face, peeled clean, held up like an offering. The bone bride walked among them, her veil trailing behind her, and wherever her foot touched, the earth split open, swallowing her footsteps. The village was collapsing inward, folding itself back into her womb of dirt and bone. The keeper's choice. Elias stood between the tree and the well, knife in hand, face drenched in sweat and blood that wasn't his. The journal, now missing more pages than it had left, lay open beside him. There was no ritual for this. No instructions for stopping a bride who had waited centuries to be remembered. There was only a choice. He could offer his face willingly, let the bone bride wear him, become him, leave the village behind like a snake shedding its skin. Or he could refuse and let the village collapse entirely, burying every face, every name, every memory forever. The child's smile, the cursed child, the one born from the earth's memory, stood beside him, bare feet in the mud, smile wide enough to crack bone. "She remembers you," the child whispered. "She's always remembered you." Elias looked into the child's eyes and saw himself, younger, standing at the edge of the village for the first time, journal in hand, still believing he could save his friends. The village had been waiting for him since before he was born. Because Elias wasn't just a visitor. He was the last groom. The wedding beneath the tree, the villagers formed a circle around the blood tree, humming the lullaby backwards, each note peeling back layers of time, until the earth itself forgot which century it was. The bone bride stood beside Elias, her hand on his heart, her fingers slowly sinking into his chest, searching for something only he had. His memory, his fear, his face, the skin offering with the knife in one hand and the veil in the other. Elias cut his own face free, skin peeling like paper, blood running like ink, memories spilling into the dirt. The bone bride caught his face before it fell. She held it to her own, pressing it against her skull like trying on a mask, and when it fit, her sewn mouth split open. She screamed, a sound so old, so full of grief and hunger, it shook the trees until their roots bled. And for the first time, she could see again. The veil reborn, the veil no longer belonged to her. It belonged to Elias, his skin now part of the village, his memories stitched into its folds. The bone bride lifted it over her head, and where her face had been, there was only his reflection, caught in the fabric like a mirror. "Now you are me," she whispered, "and I am you." The blood tree split in half, roots tearing free from the earth, branches folding inward until the tree was nothing but a hole lined with teeth. The well boiled, and from its depths came every face the village had ever swallowed, eyes wide, mouths open, screaming without sound. The villagers stepped forward, feeding their faces to the tree, skin dissolving into dirt, bones curling into roots. Elias watched his own face disappear, sinking into the soil, becoming part of the village itself. And then silence. The village reborn by dawn. The village was gone. In its place stood a single tree, taller than any house, bark the color of dried blood. No leaves, no branches, just faces, pressed into the wood, eyes wide open, watching the road for the next visitor. The final whisper, Elias no longer existed. But somewhere, in the dirt beneath that tree, his memory still hummed. Not a song, not a prayer, just a name whispered over and over again by the bone bride, who now wore his face, who now was the village. Elias, Elias, Elias. And if you ever walk too close to that road, if you ever hear someone whisper your name in the fog, do not follow it. Because the village remembers you too. The Forgotten Village, Episode 13. The last groom a road that shouldn't exist, he didn't remember his name. The road had taken it. He didn't remember why he was walking. The fog had swallowed the reason. All he knew was the village was waiting. Every step forward felt like a step back in time. The asphalt cracking into cobblestone, streetlights flickering into torches, the sky darkening into memory. The road twisted through the trees, and from somewhere up ahead came a song. A lullaby, soft, broken, sung in reverse. The kind of song that rewrites who you are. The bride already knows Elias, though the name no longer fit, stood at the village edge, a place he had stood 100 times before, in 100 different faces. Sometimes as the groom, sometimes as the sacrifice, always as the last to remember. The bone bride was waiting for him at the center of the square, her veil stitched from his own skin, her mouth stretched into his old smile, her hands folded over her heart, the heart she had taken from his chest the night before. She had worn so many faces, but she had always been waiting for his. The memory that won't die. The village remembers him more than any other, because Elias was never meant to leave. He was the last groom. The final piece of a ceremony started long before he was born, a ritual to wed the living and the dead, to bind the earth and the sky, to ensure the village would never be forgotten. Without a last groom, the curse couldn't end. Without his face, the village had no future. The bride speaks through skin. The veil moved, stretched across her face. Elias' skin twitched, mouth opening, eyes rolling, his own voice leaking out from between her lips. "I do." He had said it before. He would say it again, because the village always brings its grooms back. The procession returns. The villagers, those with no faces left of their own, gathered in silence. Their mouths were sewn with memory, their eyes filled with soil, their hands clasped over hearts that no longer beat. Each one had been a groom once. Each one had failed. The bone bride held out her hand to Elias, and though his mind screamed no, his body stepped forward. Because the village still remembered his vow. The well opens. The ground split beneath them, the well yawning wide like a throat torn open, the air filling with the scent of wet silk and rotting flowers. The bride led him to the edge. Elias looked down. There, at the bottom, stood every version of himself. Every face he had worn, every memory the village had carved from his mind. They stared up at him, mouths moving in unison, all speaking the same words: "Finish what you started." The knife of the first groom. The bride handed him a knife, the same blade used by the first groom, the man who had wed her to the earth centuries before. Its handle was made from his spine, the blade forged from his teeth. "Cut yourself free," the bride whispered through his own mouth, "or join them below." The cutting ceremony. Elias raised the knife to his own throat, not to kill, but to unmake. Every scar, every word, every memory the village had written into his flesh had to be peeled away. The first cut released the lullaby. The second cut released his fear. The third cut released his name, bleeding from his skin like ink from a spell torn apart too late. With every piece of himself that fell into the well, the village grew quieter. The bride grew smaller. The villagers grew still. The groom who refused Elias stood at the edge, bleeding, empty, face half gone, but mind suddenly clear. For the first time, he saw the village for what it was. Not a curse, but a hunger. A place that could only exist if someone remembered why it shouldn't. The first groom had been tricked, led to believe marrying the earth would save his people. Instead, it had fed the land his soul. Elias would not be the next. He dropped the knife. The bride's veil caught fire. The bride burns. Fire spread across her skin. A skin made from every groom before him, each face burning away, screaming, twisting, dissolving into smoke. The villagers collapsed where they stood, soil pouring from their mouths, bones crumbling into ash. The well began to close, memories unwritten, history collapsing, the village forgetting itself. Elias fell to his knees, watching the bride become nothing, her veil nothing but smoke curling into the sky. For the first time in centuries, the village was silent. The empty square. By dawn, the village was gone. No houses, no well, no tree, just an empty square, a road that led nowhere, and a man with no face, standing alone at the center, holding a single ring made of bone. Elias no longer knew his name, but he knew he had one. The last echo as he turned to leave, something moved beneath his skin. A whisper, a twitch, a memory refusing to die. The bride's voice soft, almost tender. There's always another groom, and beneath the dirt, beneath the ashes, beneath the place where the well had been, a new root began to grow. Because the village never truly dies. It only waits. The man without a face. Elias walked until the road turned to dirt, until the dirt turned to forest, until the forest forgot the village existed. But every time he passed a mirror, a window, or even a puddle, his reflection wore the veil. Because you can't truly leave the forgotten village. Not when you were the last groom. The invitation remains somewhere, far from the mountains. A child hums a lullaby they never learned. Somewhere, a road appears on a map that shouldn't exist. Somewhere, a man with no face knocks at a door, holding a wooden box sealed with black wax. And if you open that door, if you listen too closely, if you follow the wrong road into the fog, you might just find yourself standing in the square, wearing a face that doesn't belong to you, holding a ring made of someone else's bone. Because the village remembers everyone, especially its grooms. The Forgotten Village, Episode 14. The man with no face, the face that didn't follow Elias, stepped out of the village at dawn. The road behind him had vanished. The fog had burned away. But his face, the one the village had worn, the one the bone bride had stitched into her veil, the one reflected in the well for all eternity, it didn't leave with him. He touched his skin. Smooth, empty. There was no nose, no mouth, no eyes. Just skin stretched too tight over bone, as if someone had forgotten to finish making him. The village had taken his face, but it wasn't done with him yet. The mirror lies in the first town he stumbled into. A gas station bathroom mirror lied to him. It showed his old face, tired, dirty, but still human. He splashed water on his skin, hands trembling, heart hammering against his ribs. But when he reached up to touch his reflection, his fingers sank into glass, soft, like water, and the mirror's surface rippled. From the other side of the mirror, his reflection smiled. And that's when he knew. The village hadn't let him go. It had sent him ahead. The knock that follows that night, in a cheap motel room miles from the village, someone knocked at the door. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Elias knew that knock. It was the knock he had made, all those years ago, standing at the widow's house, asking for help, begging to understand what had happened to Lucia and Ben. He opened the door. No one stood outside. But on the ground lay a wooden box, sealed with black wax. The box that shouldn't exist, he carried it inside, hands shaking. The box was old, edges worn soft by time, the wood stained dark with something that smelled like wet earth and old skin. Elias knew what was inside before he even opened it. A face, not his, but Lucia's. The village had sent him her memory, pressed into skin like a mask meant to be worn. The message was clear. If he didn't wear it, the village would take it back and bury her forever. The first time he wore her, the mask fit too perfectly. The skin melted into his, veins threading into his bloodstream, bones shifting to match her smile. He opened his eyes and saw her memories instead of his own. Her childhood, running barefoot down the village road, singing the lullaby before it turned backwards, fingers tracing the edge of the well without fear. Her final night, hands clawing at the veil as the villagers stitched it over her face. Her scream swallowed by dirt before it could leave her throat. Elias staggered back, heart pounding in her chest, the taste of her fear on his tongue. He was no longer just himself. He was every face the village had ever taken. The Skinwalker's curse, the journal had warned about this in the last torn page, a curse reserved for the one who broke the cycle, the one who refused to become the final groom. The village cannot follow you, so it will wear you, and through you, it will find others. Elias wasn't free. He was a carrier, the village's last chance to remember itself, one face at a time. The faces that hunt, he walked for days, through towns where no one knew his name, through forests where shadows followed too closely, through streets where every window reflected a different face. Lucia, Ben, Sophia, Catalina, each face begged for release. Each face begged to be worn again. The village had become a hive inside him. Every memory, every scream, every vow broken and remade, all of it boiling beneath his skin, waiting for him to crack open like a shell too thin for the truth inside. The man in the suit at the edge of a nameless town. Elias saw him. A man standing beneath a streetlight, coat too thin, hat too wide, head tilted just so. The man who had delivered the box to the village long before Elias was born. The first keeper of faces. He raised his hand. A mirror formed in his palm. Elias saw himself. Faceless, skin smooth as marble, but behind it, the faces pressed outward, mouths open in silent screams. The man smiled. Your turn. The first visitor in the next town. Elias knocked at a door. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 2 more. A teenage boy opened it. Eyes red from crying, face pale from nightmares he didn't understand. Behind him, the boy's mother stared at Elias with recognition and fear, even though they had never met. Elias held out the box. The boy took it. The village smiled from behind Elias' empty skin. The wearing begins that night. Elias sat in a motel bathroom, peeling his own face away like wet paper, hanging it carefully over the mirror. His reflection smiled without him. He reached into the box and lifted out Ben's face. Fit too well. When he opened his eyes, he was Ben again. Memories flooding back, laughter and fear and love and grief. Every emotion layered like sediment beneath a river. Through Ben's eyes, Elias saw the village reassemble. Not in reality, but in memory, one face at a time. The village didn't need a place to exist. It only needed people who remembered. The road in the mirror, every mirror became a doorway. Not back to the village itself, but to the idea of it, the whisper of it, the legend that grew sharper every time someone asked, what really happened to that village? Every face Elias wore answered that question. Every story told built the road again. The forgotten village was no longer hidden. It was traveling, hitching a ride on Elias' back, one face at a time. The last groom reborn at dawn, Elias woke in a new town. The box was gone. The mirror no longer showed his reflection. Instead, it showed a wedding dress, hanging empty, veil freshly washed, waiting for a new bride, because the village needed a wedding. And Elias, no matter how far he ran, no matter how many faces he wore, Elias was still the last groom. The village would never stop calling him home. The invitation spreads if you hear a knock at your door. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. And no one stands outside, only a box sealed with black wax. Do not open it. If you see your reflection smiling when you aren't, do not follow the road into the fog. If you hum a lullaby you don't remember learning, bite your tongue until it bleeds. Because the forgotten village doesn't need you to visit. It only needs you to remember. And once you do, you'll see him, the man with no face, and he will offer you your own. The Forgotten Village, Episode 15. The song that opens doors, the song that came first long before there was a village. Before the well, before the bride, before the curse, there was the song. It came from the earth itself. Not sung by any human voice, but carried through the roots, whispered through the stones, hummed by the wind that rolled down the mountain. It was not a lullaby, it was a key, and every time someone sang it, a door opened, not to a place, to a memory the earth wanted to forget, and couldn't. Elias and the forgotten verse. Elias didn't sleep anymore. Sleep belonged to people who still had faces, people who still had their own skin. He sat on the motel floor, back against the wall, the black wax box resting in his lap. His fingers traced the edges, but he couldn't open it. Not yet, because outside the window someone was singing. Soft, broken, familiar, the lullaby. Only now it had a new verse, a verse no one had ever written down. A verse that only came when the village wanted to come back. The song knows your name. The voice was a child's, high and sweet, but wrong, like a broken music box struggling to play. It sang his name into the melody, bending the notes around each syllable until his name didn't sound like a name anymore. It sounded like a door unlocking. Elias covered his ears, but the song crawled inside his skin. The door that shouldn't exist, the motel room door, changed. The wood darkening, the handle twisting into something almost organic, the peephole widening into an eye that blinked. Elias didn't want to open it, but his hand moved on its own, because the song wasn't just calling him. It was calling itself home. The singer in the hallway was longer than it should have been, stretching into the dark like a throat. At the far end stood a girl, no older than 10, dress torn at the hem, hair matted with leaves and dirt, lips stitched into a smile. Her hands clutched a porcelain doll, its face cracked but still singing. The song never stopped, and neither did she. With every step forward, the hallway shrank, the walls closing in, the air thickening into fog. Elias knew this place. It wasn't a motel. It was the village road, folded inside out. The doll remembers the girl held out the doll. Elias took it, fingers brushing ceramic cold as ice. The doll's lips moved, the song pouring from its mouth like water spilling from a broken well. And with each note, a door opened inside Elias' mind. Not memories, doors to faces. Every face he had ever worn. Every memory the village had ever stolen. Every scream the earth had swallowed. The doll held them all. And now so did Elias. The house that sang the hallway led to a door Elias recognized. The widow's house, but not as he remembered it. The walls pulsed like lungs breathing. The windows wept, and from somewhere inside came the song. Not one voice now, all of them. Lucia, Ben, Sophia, Catalina, the first bride. They were all singing through the walls, their voices layered together, harmonies made from pain and dirt and silence. Elias stepped inside. The door vanished behind him. The song's true purpose in the center of the house stood a table, and on the table lay the journal. Pages torn, ink smeared, but the final page rewritten. The song wasn't just a key, it was a wedding vow. What the earth remembers, the song must seal. What the song seals, the village must wear. What the village wears, the groom must carry. And when the groom sings, the earth remembers again. The village didn't want to forget. It wanted to be remembered forever. And Elias was the only one left to sing its name. The mirror bride, the mirror above the table rippled. From the other side stepped the bone bride, her veil made of every face Elias had ever tried to leave behind. Her mouth split open wide enough to sing the entire song at once. She didn't walk toward him. She pulled him through the glass. The village inside out, Elias fell into a place that wasn't quite the village, but wasn't anywhere else either. The sky was made of skin, the ground stitched from hair, and every building was built from bones still trying to breathe. The song was the air itself, vibrating through the walls, shaking the dirt beneath his feet. This was the song's birthplace, the moment the earth learned to remember. And at the center stood the first singer, not a human, but the earth itself, wearing the face of every forgotten bride, mouth split wide enough to swallow a scream and sing it back. The final verse, the bone bride knelt beside Elias, her fingers pressing into his chest until they reached his heart. She didn't speak, she sang. The final verse, the one that ended the village forever, poured from her mouth into his chest, a melody made from every word he had ever spoken inside the village, every breath, every fear, every dream. It was his song now, and the only way to stop the village was to sing it backwards. The backward wedding. Elias stood beneath the blood tree, now growing inside his mind. The villagers gathered around him. Each one held their own face, mouths open, waiting for him to return the song. He opened his mouth and sang the village back into the ground. The fog collapsed, the well boiled dry, the tree caught fire, and the song tore itself apart, each note unraveling the memory it held, until nothing was left but silence. Elias fell, and the village forgot itself. The man with no song, he woke on the same motel floor, but the doll was gone. The black wax box was empty. The mirror showed only his own face, blank, smooth, no mouth, no eyes. Because to erase the village, he had to erase the song inside him. Elias was free, but only because there was nothing left of him to haunt. The song always finds a way somewhere. In another town, a child hums a lullaby their grandmother used to sing. Somewhere, a road appears on a map where no road should be. Somewhere, a man with no face walks past a mirror, and his reflection sings when he doesn't. The village is gone, but the song remembers. And if you ever hear it, soft, broken, sung backwards at the edge of your hearing, close your eyes, cover your ears, forget your own name, because if you remember the song remembers you. And the next time you hum it, the door will open again. The Forgotten Village, Episode 16. The bride beneath the skin that didn't fit. Elias stared at his reflection, or what was left of it. The motel mirror showed a bride, veil draped over her face, hands folded neatly at her waist, nails blackened with dirt that would never wash off. But when Elias raised his hand, so did she. The bone bride had moved in. Her skin was beneath his skin now. A second flesh, cold and thin, stretched too tight across his bones. Every time he breathed, he could feel her breathe too. She wasn't haunting him. She was wearing him from the inside out. The first stain, it started after the song that opens doors, when Elias sang the lullaby backwards, unraveling the village stitch by stitch. He thought he was closing the door forever, but some doors don't close. They climb inside you. The village was gone, but the bride had found a new home, beneath Elias' skin, curled up like a fetus, her fingers wrapped around his heart, her veil woven through his veins. She wasn't dead. She was becoming him, the memory that bled when Elias touched his face. His fingers came away red. Not blood, memory. It leaked from his pores, sticky and warm, scenes of Lucia's last night, of the villagers stitching lips shut, of the first bride stepping into the well, all running down his skin like wet ink from a cursed page. The bone bride wasn't just wearing him. She was rewriting him. The bride's history, he couldn't sleep. Every time his eyes closed, he saw her memories, not his own. A girl, no older than 16, wrapped in a dress spun from funeral shrouds, walking barefoot to the well. Her parents stood silent, their eyes sewn shut to avoid the curse. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She only sang the first verse of the lullaby. It was her wedding vow, a promise to the earth that her body would belong to the village forever. And now her body belonged to Elias. The veil that grew each morning, the veil grew longer. It started at his scalp, fine strands of hair weaving into thread, pale as bone. By noon, it reached his shoulders. By nightfall, it trailed the floor. When he tried to cut it, the scissors rusted in his hand. When he tried to burn it, the flames curled away. The veil wasn't cloth anymore. It was his own skin, unraveling into memory. The mirror bride, on the third night, the mirror cracked. Elias saw two reflections. One of himself, pale and shaking, and one of the bone bride, standing just behind him, her veil covering both their faces, her hands folded over both their hearts. She whispered, "You can't leave a place that lives inside you." And when Elias blinked, he was her. Standing at the well, veil trailing in the dirt, villagers watching with mouths sewn shut. She had brought him back. The return that wasn't Elias stumbled out of the motel and found himself not in the parking lot, but in the village square. The blood tree was back. The well was open. The fog curled at his feet, whispering his wedding vows. The village hadn't returned. It had never left. It had been inside him all along, waiting for the bride beneath the skin to wake up. The wedding repeated. The villagers gathered in silence, faces peeled, memories missing, hands clutching nothing. They formed a circle around Elias and the bone bride, humming the lullaby. Backward, forward, at once. The air folded. The village was rewriting time itself. The second groom, the bone bride, spoke through Elias' mouth, her voice layered with every bride who came before her, each word a thread pulled tight. "You broke the vow. Now you must take his place." A door opened at the base of the blood tree. Inside stood the first groom, his skin blackened, mouth sewn into a permanent scream, holding a veil made from his own memories. Elias recognized the face. It was his own. The cycle revealed the truth burned through his mind like fire through dry leaves. There was never a first bride and a first groom. There was only one bride, one groom, married over and over again, face after face, body after body, each generation forced to wear the ones who came before them. The village didn't marry the earth. The village married itself, feeding its own history into flesh, wearing the same two souls forever. Elias had always been the groom, and the bride had always been inside him. The bride peels free the veil wrapped around Elias' neck, tightening until his skin split, and from the wound crawled the bone bride herself, her fingers still clutching his heart, her mouth still singing. She stepped out of him like a butterfly from a cocoon. Elias fell to his knees. Empty, hollow, nothing left but skin and fear. She had taken everything. The final vow the villagers knelt as the bone bride stepped forward, veil flowing behind her, hair dragging in the dirt. She held Elias' face in her hands. Not his real face, but the face the village remembered, the face of every groom before him, stitched together into one perfect mask. She placed it over her own, and whispered, "I do." The well seals the earth side. The blood tree bloomed, and the well sealed shut, burying the bride, the groom, the village, all of it, inside Elias' hollow skin. He stood, but he was no longer Elias. He was the bride beneath the skin, the one who would walk the earth, wearing every face the village had ever taken, singing the lullaby wherever he went, until the next bride woke inside someone else. The road awaits. Elias walked back to the motel, feet bare, veil trailing behind him. No one noticed, because the bride knows how to hide inside a face. And somewhere in another town, a mirror cracked. Somewhere, a child hummed a song they never learned. Somewhere, a road appeared on a map where no road should be. Because the village isn't gone. It's just waiting beneath the skin. The invitation you can't refuse if you ever find a veil at the foot of your bed. If your reflection wears someone else's face. If you hear a knock 3 times, pause, then 2. Do not open the door. Because the bride is still walking. And she's always looking for the next groom. The Forgotten Village, Episode 17. The house that eats names the house that shouldn't exist. Elias thought the village was gone. He thought the bone bride had taken her final vow, the well had closed, and the blood tree had swallowed the last memory. He was wrong, because somewhere beyond the fog, where no map leads and no road remembers, there stood a house. Not the widow's house, not a cabin or a shack, a house without a door. It had no windows, no path leading to it, just walls that breathed, wood that remembered, and inside, a silence so heavy it could crush a name into dust. This was where the village hid its secrets. This was where names went to die. The name that fled. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the house. He didn't remember how he got here. He didn't remember his name. The bone bride had taken it, or so he thought. But the house knew better. Because inside the house, behind the walls, beneath the floorboards, was a heart that beat with his name. The village didn't just eat people. It ate their names first. The names inside the walls were not wood. They were flesh, stretched thin, tattooed with every name the village had ever swallowed. Elias touched the wall and his fingers burned, because his name was there too, written in blood, but not his own handwriting. It was written by the first groom, the one who first married the earth, who signed his name into the dirt to seal the pact. Elias, a name passed down like a curse, worn by every groom, every bride, every sacrifice. The house didn't just eat names, it rebirthed them. The bride's true name. In the center of the house stood a table. On the table lay a veil, the same veil every bride had worn, woven from the hair of those who came before. Beneath the veil lay a single page from the widow's journal. It held the bone bride's real name, the name she gave up to become part of the curse. Maria Isabel Rojas. The name was still alive, letters twitching on the page, trying to crawl back into the earth. But the earth had no mouth. Only the house could swallow names. The forgotten ceremony. Elias remembered the ceremony, the one whispered about in the back pages of the journal, the one no one ever completed. It wasn't a wedding, it was a burial. The bride and groom weren't married to each other. They were married to the village itself, buried alive beneath their own names, until their identities rotted into soil, feeding the next generation of cursed lovers. The house was where they came to lose themselves, where they came to be renamed by the earth. The name eater in the corner of the house stood a figure, bent double, skin pale as candle wax, fingers too long, mouth sewn shut except for one hole. A hole just wide enough for a whisper to escape. This was the name eater. The one who carved names from flesh, who fed them to the walls, who replaced them with whatever the village needed. Elias had met him before. Every groom had. The wedding of names. The name eater held out his hand. In his palm lay a knife carved from teeth, every tooth pulled from every mouth that had ever spoken the forbidden song. He placed the knife in Elias' hand. No words were spoken. The house spoke through silence. Elias understood. To leave the house, to leave the village, he had to cut his name free. And to do that, he had to cut out every name that had ever lived inside him. Lucia, Ben, Sophia, Catalina, Maria Isabel Rojas. Every name the village had ever forced him to carry. The carving. Elias stripped off his shirt. His skin wasn't skin anymore. It was a page, names carved deep, layered over each other. Every letter a scar, every scar a memory. He pressed the knife to his chest and cut. Each name peeled away like wet paper, dissolving into the air, whispering as they left. I remember you. I remember me. I remember us. The house shuddered, because the house couldn't survive without names to eat. The bride reborn as the last name fell away. The veil lifted on its own, and beneath it stood the bone bride. No longer a ghost, no longer a curse, but a girl 16 again, her face bare, her mouth no longer stitched shut. She held out her hand. In her palm lay the ring, not gold, not silver, but bone, carved from the first groom's spine, inscribed with every name that had ever worn it. She placed the ring in Elias' hand. Give me your name. The final vow. Elias understood. The only way to end it, truly end it, was to give up his own name. Not just forget it, erase it, become no one, nothing, not even a memory the village could hold on to. He whispered his name into her ear. The bone bride swallowed it. And for the first time, the house let go. The house collapses, the walls folded inward. The roof split open. The floor swallowed itself. Every name the house had ever eaten poured out into the sky. A cloud of letters, names spoken for the first time in centuries, memories escaping back into the air. Lucia, Ben, Sophia, Catalina, Maria Isabel Rojas, Elias, and then silence. The house was gone. Elias was gone. The man with no name. He walked out of the clearing, down a road that no longer led anywhere, past a village that no longer existed, wearing a face that no one could remember. He couldn't remember it either, because without a name, there was nothing left to hold him in place. He was free, and so was the village, the whisper that remains somewhere, in a town that never heard of the forgotten village. A child dreams of a house with no doors. Somewhere, a name appears in a book that no one remembers writing. Somewhere, a man with no name walks into a bar, orders a drink, and when the bartender asks his name, he just smiles. Because without a name, you can go anywhere. And if you ever wake up one day unable to remember your own name, don't follow the road into the fog, because the house is still hungry, and it remembers your face. The Forgotten Village, Episode 18. The wedding that never ends. A groom without a name. Elias had no name. He had left it inside the house. He had carved it from his skin. He had burned it in the dirt. Without a name, the village couldn't follow him. Without a name, the curse should have ended. But curses don't live in names. They live in vows. And vows never die. The road reappears for 2 days. Elias walked. His feet bled. His mouth stayed shut. He didn't dare hum, didn't dare whisper, didn't dare let the song slip past his lips. But on the third day, the fog returned. The road stretched out before him, the same road that led to the village, even though the village was gone. And at the end of the road stood an altar, a wedding altar, waiting for a groom with no name. The bride beneath the veil floated in the air, untouched by wind, suspended like a spider's web spun from bone. The closer Elias walked, the tighter his chest grew, because he knew this veil. It wasn't the bone bride's veil. It was his own. The village hadn't forgotten him. It had married him to itself so deeply, even after his name was gone, his vow remained. And vows pull harder than memory. The guests that weren't alive, rows of chairs lined the road. In each chair sat a face Elias had once known. Lucia, Ben, Sophia, Catalina, Maria Isabel Rojas, their hands folded neatly in their laps, mouths sewn shut, eyes wide and wet with dirt. They couldn't speak. They couldn't leave. But they could witness, because a wedding isn't real unless someone sees it happen. And this wedding had been happening for centuries. The ceremony of dust and bone, the officiant stood at the altar. A man with no face, no hands, no skin. His body was made from dust swept off the village floor, shaped into the memory of a man, held together only by the weight of the vow itself. He held out the knife, the same knife that had cut Elias free from his name. His blade was clean again, waiting to cut something more permanent. "Do you take this village to be your bride?" the officiant asked. Elias shook his head, but his hand reached for the knife anyway, because the vow had no mouth, but it could still speak through his bones. The ring that bit back, the officiant offered a ring, a circle of teeth, each one taken from a groom who came before. Elias slid it onto his finger, and the teeth bit down, sinking into his flesh until the ring became part of his hand. "With this ring, you are bound to memory. With this ring, you are bound to earth. With this ring, you are bound to us." The villagers nodded in unison. The road hummed. The veil descended. The veil covers the world. Elias expected the veil to cover his face. Didn't. It stretched over everything, the road, the chairs, the fog, the sky, until the whole world was wrapped in it. A cocoon of skin and memory, turning the sky pale, the air thick with the smell of wet silk and old earth. The wedding was not for Elias and the bride. It was for Elias and the village itself. A marriage between a man and a place. A vow that would outlive death. The dance of the faceless. A wedding needs a dance. The villagers stood, hands clasped, spinning in a slow, silent waltz, their feet leaving no prints, their bodies leaving no shadows. Elias stood in the center, alone, until the veil moved. From the folds of the veil stepped every version of himself. Elias the boy, Elias the seeker, Elias the fool who thought he could save his friends. They danced with him, hands cold, skin thin, every step pressing the vow deeper into his bones. "You are the village now," they whispered. "And the village is you." The feast of forgotten names. After the dance came the feast. The table stretched the length of the road, set with plates carved from skulls, goblets filled with memory, bread baked from letters that no one remembered writing. Elias took his seat at the head. The villagers offered him a plate. On it lay his own face, not the one he had now, the one he had before the village stole it, before the curse began, before his own name was carved away. "Eat," the officiant said. "To remember." Elias ate, and with every bite he forgot someone else. The groom becomes the village by dawn. There was no road, no chairs, no veil. Only Elias, standing alone, with no face, no name, no voice. Only a vow where his heart used to be. Because the village doesn't need to exist in the world. It only needs to exist inside him. He was no longer Elias. He was the next door, the next whisper, the next reason someone would follow a road into the fog. The wedding that starts again somewhere, far from the mountains. A child hums a song they never learned. Somewhere, a mirror reflects a veil where no one stands. Somewhere, A man with no face knocks at a door, holding a box sealed with black wax, and inside the box is a single wedding ring made of teeth. If you open the door, if you take the box, if you try on the ring, you become the groom. And the wedding begins again. Because the village doesn't need land. It only needs... Because the village doesn't need land. It only needs a heart. The final vow. Elias walked into the next town. His face wasn't his. His skin was a veil. And inside his chest, the village still sang. Do you take this village to be your bride? Elias opened his mouth. The villagers spoke through him. I do. The invitation that never ends. If you ever hear a knock, 3 times, a pause, then 2 more, don't open the door. If you see a man standing in the fog, wearing a veil made of faces that almost look familiar, don't follow him. If you ever hum a song and forget where you learned it, bite your tongue until it bleeds, because the wedding never ends, and the village always needs a groom. The Forgotten Village, Episode 19. The final knock, the knock that never stops. Elias stood in front of a door that didn't exist. It was neither wood nor stone, just an absence, a gap where the world had been torn open, a doorway that never led to the same place twice. And from the other side came a knock. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more. The knock followed him. Every town, every motel, every mirror. No matter where he ran, the door found him again. Because the village wasn't behind him. It was inside him. The house that waited. The last time Elias opened this door, he lost his name. The time before that, he lost his face. This time, he knew the price would be everything else. But he had no choice. The knock would never stop. And if he didn't open the door, it would open him instead. The shadow in the hallway. The door swung open into darkness. A hallway stretched forward, too long, too narrow, the walls breathing like lungs pressed too tight against bone. And at the end of the hallway stood a shadow. Not a person, not a ghost. A space where something had once been. The first groom, the first sacrifice, the first voice to ever say, I do. It raised one hand and pointed. Come home. The road backwards. Elias stepped forward. With each step, the hallway unfolded time, rewinding, pulling him back into every moment he had ever lived inside the village. The first time he followed the fog. The first time he saw the blood tree bleed. The first time he heard the song. The first time he saw the veil waiting for him. The past wasn't behind him anymore. It was beneath his skin. The wedding that never ends. The hallway emptied into the church. Not a church built from wood. A church built from faces. The pews were lined with those who had come before. Lucia, Ben, Sophia, Catalina, Maria Isabel Rojas. Each of them frozen in place. Their skin stretched thin over bone that wasn't theirs anymore. At the altar stood the bone bride. Her veil was gone. Her hands were folded. And in her grasp, she held the book of names. Elias' name was still inside. But now there was only one space left. The final name, the final vow, the final groom, the book of the dead. The bone bride opened the book. Every page was skin. Every letter was carved in blood. She held out the knife. Sign. Elias had spent his entire life running from this page. If he signed, he would become the village itself, the next doorway, the next shadow in the fog, the next voice whispering through mirrors. If he refused, the village would keep calling, keep knocking, keep wearing his face until there was nothing left of him at all. Either way, he belonged to it. The choice that wasn't a choice. Elias took the knife. The villagers leaned forward in their seats. The bone bride watched him without blinking. The first groom smiled for the first time in centuries. Elias pressed the blade to his palm. Blood welled, thick and black as ink, soaking into the page, writing itself before he could stop it. He had always belonged to the village, because the village was made from him. The bride fades. The bone bride stepped back. Her veil dissolved. Her body turned to dust. Her memories became Elias' own. She had never been real. She had only been a name waiting for a groom to wear it again. And now that he had signed, she no longer needed to exist. The The village had found its final shape, and Elias had become the thing he feared most. The door closes, the walls collapsed. The church folded into the fog. The pews cracked, their occupants falling into dust, their names swallowed back into the earth. Elias was the only thing left standing. Because Elias was the last part of the village that still needed to be forgotten. He turned to leave, but there was nowhere left to go. The road that doesn't end. Elias walked, and walked, and walked. Every town looked the same. Every mirror showed a different face. Every street led back to a door he had already opened. Because the village wasn't a place anymore. It was him, and wherever he went, it followed. Not behind him, inside him. The knock at the door somewhere, in another town, another motel, another moment, a door appears where it shouldn't. Someone will hear a knock. 3 times. A pause. Then 2 more. And when they open it, they'll see a man standing in the fog. His face will be familiar. His voice will be every voice that ever said, "I do." And when he hands them a book of names, there will be only one space left. One name waiting to be signed. Maybe yours. The village never dies because the village was never a place. The village was never a curse. The village was a promise. And promises don't break. They wait. The last whisper, if you ever hear a knock at your door, 3 times, a pause, then 2 more, do not open it. If you see your name in a book before you've written it, burn the page. If you hear a voice in the fog whisper, "Come home," bite your tongue until it bleeds. Because the village doesn't need you to live in it. It only needs you to remember it. And once you do, the knock will come for you too. The Forgotten Village, Episode 20. The last name, the name that wouldn't die. Elias had no face, no voice, no skin of his own. But deep inside his chest, there was still a name. Not his, not Lucia's, not even the Bone Bride's. It was the first name, the name that started everything. The name no one had dared speak aloud. The name the earth itself tried to forget, but couldn't. The name of the village before it became forgotten. The bride inside him. Elias walked through a town with no name. His feet left no prints. His breath left no fog. Every window reflected a veil where his face should have been. The Bone Bride was gone, but her memory was stitched into his bones. She didn't need to haunt him anymore. Because Elias had become the vessel. Every bride, every groom, every name, he carried them all. The song that sealed the door, he heard it every night. The lullaby sung backwards, from the inside of his skull. It wasn't a song to put children to sleep. It was a spell to seal the first wedding, the original vow between the first groom and the land itself. The vow that created the village. The song was a lock, and Elias was the key. The village that became a name before it was forgotten, before it became a curse. The village had a name so old even the earth itself couldn't hold it anymore. The name was the village, and the village was the name. To remember it was to bring it back. To forget it was to set it free. Elias was the only one left who still knew it. It was burned into his ribs, carved into his spine, whispered in his blood. He couldn't forget, because the village was him. The last visitor somewhere, in a motel on the edge of nowhere. A boy opened his door. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 more. Elias stood outside, faceless, holding the black wax box. The boy's mother saw him first. She screamed. But when the boy saw Elias' reflection in the window, he didn't see a monster. He saw his own face, because the village needed a new name, and the boy was the last one left to carry it. The naming ceremony, Elias placed the box at the boy's feet. Inside was the book of names, its pages soaked with rain and blood, ink smeared into shapes that almost looked like letters, but not quite. The boy opened the book. The pages turned on their own. At the very end, there was a blank space, waiting for the last name. The name that waited the villagers appeared, not in flesh, but in reflections, their faces caught in windows, puddles, mirrors, spoons. Each face was one Elias had worn. Each face belonged to someone the village had swallowed. Lucia, then Sofia, Catalina, Maria Isabel Rojas, Elias. They whispered together, "Write it." The boy lifted the pen. Elias stepped forward, and from somewhere deep in his bones, the first name rose like smoke. The name that created the curse, it was a name older than the village. A name given to the first bride, before her skin turned to veil, before her song turned backwards, before her wedding became a burial. The name was Niverita, a word that meant nothing in any human tongue, but to the earth it meant home. It meant place of the promised dead. It meant the village that can never be forgotten. Elias spoke the name aloud. The boy wrote it down. The book shook in his hands. The village remade the ground outside the motel split open. Not just the road, the earth itself. Roots crawled upward, shaped into houses and wells, trees and walls, faces and hands. The village rebuilt itself from the inside out, rising like a corpse dug from a grave too shallow. The villagers stepped forward. Each wore their own skin, sewn back together from memory and dirt. The blood tree stood tallest of all, and from its branches hung the veil. Not just one veil, every veil. The wedding begins again. The boy looked at Elias. Elias looked at the boy. They understood, without speaking, that the boy would become the new groom, and Elias would become the new officiant, the one who knocks, the one who delivers the box, the one who never leaves. The village needed a groom. The village always needs a groom. The groom that was never meant to be. Elias watched as the veil crawled down from the tree, wrapping itself around the boy's shoulders, whispering the vows into his ear. Blood remembers, soil binds, song seals. Elias tried to look away, but he couldn't, because his name was still inside the veil too. He hadn't escaped. He had only become part of the fabric. The book that closed itself. The boy finished writing his name. The ink bled through the page, spreading to every other name, connecting them like veins in a living body. The book closed on its own, and Elias disappeared. The keeper without a face. He stood at the village edge, wearing no face of his own, holding the box again. The village was whole. The curse was sealed. The road was waiting. Somewhere, far away, another boy would dream of a song he never learned. Somewhere, a door would appear where no door should be. Somewhere, someone would hear the knock. Because the village doesn't need to exist. It only needs to be remembered. The last name. The boy stood alone in the square, the veil trailing behind him, his face already beginning to fade. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but he couldn't remember his own name, because the village had eaten it. And once the village eats your name, it owns you forever. The road reopens at dawn. The fog rolled in. The road stretched out. The villagers gathered to watch. And at the edge of the village stood Elias, now only a shadow, knocking at a door that didn't exist, waiting for the next name to be written. Because the village never dies. It only waits for you. The final warning: if you hear the knock 3 times, pause, 2 more. If you see your reflection, smile when you didn't. If you hum a song no one taught you, don't write your name down. Don't open the door. Don't follow the road. Because the village doesn't need you to live there. It only needs your name.